Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're diving straight into a really pivotal moment happening up in Washington.
Yeah, it's about that Republican budget resolution that just passed the House.
Exactly. And this isn't just, another vote ticking a box. It feels like the essential first move for getting President Trump's agenda really moving.
Definitely. And it centers on some big things. Tax cuts, obviously, but also these pretty intense debates about spending cuts.
Which, for you listening, trying to follow all this, it can feel a bit like, well, decoding a different language sometimes.
For sure. So our mission here really is to cut through that complexity, get to the heart of what's going on, maybe point out some surprising details you haven't heard.
And ultimately just explain why it actually matters.
Right. And to do that, we've gathered quite a range of sources. We're looking at reporting from places like PBS NewsHour, Politico, Lockhaven.com, Newsweek, AEI, the American Enterprise Institute, and AP News. Plus, we've got a briefing doc that kind of lays out the basics.
So the goal is to help you really grasp the key parts of this budget plan.
Yeah, and also the disagreements within the Republican Party, that's important, plus how the Democrats are responding and, the wider political implications.
Okay, let's start with that first step then. This budget resolution actually passing the House. It wasn't exactly a landslide victory for them, was it?
No, not at all. It was really close. Squeaked through 216 to 214. That vote happened on a Thursday, mid-April.
Wow, a 2-vote margin.
Exactly. That tells you a lot right there.
Yeah.
Every single Democrat voted against it. And crucially, 2 Republicans joined them. Thomas Mancey from Kentucky and Victoria Spartz from Indiana.
2 Republicans peeling off with that kind of tiny majority. That really highlights the internal friction, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It shows how precarious that majority is. And it suggests, future votes needing party unity could be just as tough.
Was there doubt beforehand? Did it look like it might not pass?
Oh, yeah. There was definite uncertainty. You had a group of House Republicans, mostly the more conservative ones, who felt the spending cuts the Senate was talking about were just nowhere near enough.
So they were holding out.
They were holding out, pushing for much deeper cuts before they'd agree to vote yes.
And President Trump, he's been pretty vocal. What was his role in getting this over the line?
He was definitely involved, pushing forward on social media, talking up how important it was for Republicans. He sounded pretty confident it would pass.
Which it did, just barely.
It's barely.
Yep.
And this push, this urgency, it seems tied to getting those tax cut extensions done. Some sources suggest they see it as, key for firing up their base before the midterms.
Okay, so the resolution gets through the House. Now the focus shifts to what Trump calls the big, beautiful bill. Tax cuts seem to be front and center there.
That's the absolute core goal, yes. Expanding the individual income tax cuts from his first term. They're set to expire at the end of this year, so there's a deadline.
And that's seen as crucial, not just policy, but politically.
Both. Fulfilling a promise, definitely, but also strategically important for the elections coming up.
Is it just extending the old cuts, or is there talk of new ones too?
Well, there's definitely talk. Things Trump mentioned on the campaign trail, like maybe no income tax on tips or overtime pay.
Okay.
And one source even mentioned the much bigger idea of potentially no taxes on Social Security income, though that seems maybe more aspirational right now.
Wow, 0 tax on Social Security. That's huge. But even sticking to the current cuts, extending those, that sounds expensive.
Incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
Just extending the 2017 cuts, the estimates are around $5.5 trillion added to the national debt over 10 years.
$5.5 trillion.
Yeah, and that includes the interest.
Yeah.
If you start adding in Trump's other potential tax cut ideas, some estimates push that figure towards $7 trillion.
$7 trillion. That's quite a number. And didn't the Senate do something creative with the accounting to maybe make the cost look smaller initially?
Yes, that's right. There are reports they used a kind of budgetary maneuver. The idea was to avoid classifying the roughly $4.5 trillion cost of the 2017 extensions as new spending under certain budget rules.
How does that work?
Essentially framing it as just continuing existing policy, not a fresh expense. It helps navigate some procedural rules, maybe makes the initial sticker shock seem lower.
But that didn't sit well with everyone.
No. Apparently, it really angered some of the House conservatives. They felt it wasn't, a straight or transparent way to handle the actual cost.
Okay, so tax cuts are the big driver. But the flip side is spending cuts. And that seems to be where the real Republican infighting is happening, especially House versus Senate.
Exactly. That's the major fault line. You have the conservative wing in the House, think the Freedom Caucus folks, saying very clearly, our support depends on getting at least $2 trillion in budget cuts over the decade.
$2 trillion. That was their line in the sand.
Pretty much. That was a key demand they laid out.
And what was the Senate offering initially?
Well, the first framework from the Senate side proposed only about $4 billion in cuts.
$2 billion with a B, compared to trillion.
Yeah. $4 billion versus $2 trillion. That massive gap just highlights the fundamental disagreement and maybe a lack of trust between the chambers on how much to cut. House Republicans were openly skeptical the Senate would actually deliver big cuts.
I remember reading some pretty sharp quotes about that skepticism. Something about selling a house.
That's right. Representative Ralph Norman put it very bluntly. He said, it's like you charge for your house $100,000 and I come back with $1,000. How do you bridge that gulf?
Yeah, that paints a picture.
It really does. And you heard others, too. Rep. Chip Roy saying he was tired of the fake math. Rep. Scott Perry saying the rest of America has to do math, implying Congress wasn't. Rep. Eric Burleson called the Senate cuts anemic.
Just really dismissive. So with that level of distrust, how did House leadership get the conservatives on board for the initial resolution vote? What promises were made on cuts?
Well, the reporting suggests House leadership basically assured those conservative members they would fight hard for a final deal that included at least $1.5 trillion in spending cuts.
So less than the $2 trillion demand, but much more than the Senate's initial offer.
Exactly. That $1.5 trillion figure seemed to be enough just to bring enough holdouts along to get that razor-thin passage.
Now, when we talk about these big spending cut numbers, one specific program keeps coming up as a major flashpoint: Medicaid.
You're absolutely right. When you aim for trillions in cuts, big federal programs like Medicaid, which covers health care for millions, naturally come under the microscope. And that's causing a lot of concern.
And not just from Democrats, right?
No, not just Democrats. It's hitting closer to home for some Republicans, too.
Because didn't President Trump himself weigh in on Medicaid benefits specifically?
Yes. According to Representative Max Miller, Trump has apparently said he doesn't want benefit cuts for people who rely on Medicaid.
That creates a potential conflict, doesn't it? Wanting huge overall cuts, but wanting to protect Medicaid benefits.
It definitely creates tension. How do you square that circle? It puts pressure on where else cuts could come from.
And we've heard concerns from other Republicans, too. Lawmakers worried about the impact in their states or districts.
Yes, quite clearly. Representative Nicole Malliotakis from New York said she wouldn't back cuts hurting vulnerable New Yorkers on Medicaid. Senator Susan Collins, who's up for re-election, was also very direct.
What did she say?
She said she wouldn't support cuts that harm low-income families, people with disabilities, seniors, or, importantly for her state, rural hospitals.
And didn't some Senate Republicans even vote with Democrats on this?
We did, on amendments aimed at protecting Medicaid funding. Senator Collins was among them. It shows there's real unease about this, crossing party lines, and even within the GOP itself.
So Democrats are saying, look, you can't get these kinds of massive savings without actually cutting benefits, hitting Medicaid, food stamps, things like that. What's the Republican response? How do they say they'll save the money?
The main argument you hear from Republicans centers on things like stricter work requirements for able-bodied adults receiving benefits, and also conducting tougher eligibility checks. They argue that by ensuring only those genuinely needing help get it, they can find big savings without cutting the core benefits for the most vulnerable.
But Democrats are skeptical that adds up to trillions.
Highly skeptical. They argue those kinds of measures won't generate anywhere near the level of savings being discussed.
Trying to manage all these competing demands, the hardline conservatives wanting deep cuts, the moderates worried about Medicaid. That sounds like an incredibly tough job for Speaker Johnson, especially with that tiny House majority.
It's a huge challenge, a real tightrope walk. He has to keep the conservative wing happy. They're insisting on these big cuts. But he also has to listen to the moderates, Republicans, in potentially swing districts where deep cuts could be politically toxic.
But despite all that pressure, he seems to be projecting confidence, saying they'll get a final bill done.
He has, yes. Publicly, he's optimistic they could reach a final agreement. He seems to think the House can win concessions from the Senate on both the tax side and the spending cuts.
Is there a time pressure element, too?
Definitely. There's the upcoming spring recess they want to act before, and then, of course, looking ahead, the 2026 midterm elections are always sort of looming in the background.
What's the general take on Johnson himself right now? How is he seen within the party?
It's interesting. That AEI analysis we mentioned paints a fairly positive picture of him, calls him likable, effective, suggests he's benefited from Trump's strong backing, and the fact there isn't really a strong challenger for his position right now.
So his relationship with Trump helps him manage these internal fights.
Apparently so. The analysis suggests he uses that relationship effectively to kind of navigate the different factions within the Republican conference.
Okay, let's flip to the other side. The Democrats, they seem completely united against this whole Republican plan.
Absolutely. United in opposition. Their main argument, their narrative is pretty clear.
Which is?
That this is fundamentally about giving huge tax cuts to the rich and big corporations and paying for it by cutting programs that ordinary Americans rely on.
So framing it as a giveaway to the wealthy at the expense of social programs.
Precisely. They argue the burden of these cuts will inevitably fall on things like Medicaid, food aid, and other essential services.
And they're being quite vocal in their criticism.
Very vocal.
Yeah.
Representative Jim McGovern had a sharp take. He suggested Republicans are too worried about their primary voters and wealthy donors, but should be more worried about the general election.
And didn't the Democratic leader issue a challenge?
Yes. House Democratic leader Hakeem Jeffries challenged Speaker Johnson directly to a one-on-one debate to basically hash out their completely different visions for the budget.
Now, one of the sources mentioned something a bit unusual back in March, a vote where almost all Democrats opposed a funding bill that included extending TANF, temporary assistance for needy families.
That's a really interesting point, yeah. TANF is generally a program Democrats support, providing cash aid to families. But on that specific continuing resolution vote in March, nearly all House Democrats voted no.
Which meant voting against the TANF extension that was part of it.
Exactly. As one analysis noted, it was an unusual move. It might suggest some shifting strategies or priorities within the Democratic caucus on welfare funding, maybe a decision to oppose even short-term funding if it doesn't fit their bigger picture goals.
And there was also a perspective in one source suggesting the Democrats' focus. They termed it identity politics. Might be pushing some voters away.
Yes, one source, coming from a more conservative viewpoint, made that argument. It claimed the party's emphasis on identity issues and demanding ideological conformity is maybe backfiring.
How so?
The argument was that it's causing some traditionally Democratic voters to feel ignored or left behind, potentially explaining some electoral shifts we've seen. It's one perspective on current political dynamics.
Okay, pulling back to the really big picture here.
Yeah.
What's the wider context for all these budget battles in Washington? What else is going on?
Well, it's happened against a backdrop of, frankly, a lot of economic uncertainty. There are still worries about a potential slowdown, maybe even recession. Plus, the whole question of President Trump's proposed tariffs and how markets might react.
And this budget plan is tied into the debt ceiling too, right?
Inextricably linked. They need to raise the federal debt limit soon. And this budget process is seen as the vehicle for doing that, or at least setting the stage for it.
Any other factors?
We heard Senator Lindsey Graham suggest maybe they'd have to split the bill up, deal with border security or defense funding separately if the whole budget package gets bogged down.
Okay.
And just in the broader public conversation, you have influential figures like Elon Musk publicly calling for big cuts to government spending, which adds another layer to the debate around fiscal policy.
All right, so wrapping up this deep dive, it really seems like this Republican budget resolution, passed by that incredibly narrow margin, is step one, a crucial step towards big tax cuts, which Trump really wants.
Definitely step one. But it's also kicked off what looks like a really tough fight over spending cuts. The size of those cuts is causing major splits within the Republican Party itself.
And they're facing solid opposition from Democrats, with programs like Medicaid right in the center of that storm.
Medicaid is absolutely a key flashpoint. The potential impact there is causing concern across the political spectrum, it seems.
So hopefully, listening to this, you've gotten past just the headlines and understand more of the tricky trade-offs and the internal battles going on here.
Yeah, understanding the why behind the numbers and the votes.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. Thinking long-term, what are the real consequences going to be? If these tax cuts happen, if these spending changes go through, what does that mean for the national debt down the road? What does it mean for the social safety net?
And how might these internal Republican fights we've been talking about shape the next election? There are some really fundamental choices about the country's financial future tangled up in all this.
Definitely something to keep thinking about. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.